Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world. We will start the webinar officially in about a minute and a half. We just want to give time for our attendees to populate the event. So we'll be back to you very soon.
Hi Cameron, a quick tech check. It says that my video is disabled by the Zoom host. If you could just open it up for me.
Sure. Okay, how about now?
Hello, and welcome to this morning's side event, Enhancing Governance to Help Address Vulnerable Groups. This HLPF 2022 side event has been organized by the University of North Carolina Water Institute, a member of the Re-Energize DR3, a project funded by the Belmont Forum, and focused on studying disaster risk reduction and resilience for sustainable development. Today, we will hear from members of the Re-Energize as well as friends of the project representing other international organizations interested in furthering sustainable development around the world. I'm Charles Newhan, Chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, your host and moderator today. I'm joined today by Re-Energize DR3 project members Cameron McBroom-Fitterer and Alex Chantelis, along with Professor Felix Dodds, who manages the University of North Carolina arm of the Re-Energize DR3 work. While today's presentations will cover a range of perspectives related to sustainable development, the overarching theme is vulnerability. Both the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change have shown the need to build strong, resilient, and inclusive governance structures that support vulnerable populations and leave no one behind. Our goals are to look at adaptive governance capabilities at the national, subnational, and local levels to enable equitable disaster risk reduction and resilience in developing planning and development programs, and to compare a developed country and a developing country approach and what lessons might be gained on governance and approaches to vulnerable groups. Ultimately, the hope is to contribute to an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary agenda where government's plans enable equitable disaster risk reduction and resilience in development planning and development programs. Before I introduce our speakers, there's a bit of housekeeping to attend to. The Zoom webinar platform allows for attendees to ask questions in the dedicated Q&A space, the question and answer space. Please use the Q&A space for questions, not the chat section. The chat box is for other comments, for you to communicate with each other if you wish, and for you to share links and resources related to today's subject. So whether it's a document or a web link related to this subject, we would certainly welcome that into the chat box. Please also note that while this event is being recorded for future reference and transcription, that recording will be made public. If you would like to access the recording to share with others, please put your contact details in the chat box. Those of you who are attending will see that there wasn't a registration link, so we haven't captured any contact details for you. So if you do want to have a copy of the recording, or more importantly, even share it with others, please do add your details into the chat box, and the host will save that information and share the video and perhaps other related matters with you. Lastly, I'd like to remind our speakers that in order to keep to our schedule and to allow adequate time for questions and answers, you will each have 8 to 10 minutes to present. And I ask that all of you please adhere to your allotted time. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker. Dr. Catalina Spotera is a professor in global energy and resources and the head and scientific director of Islands Research Laboratory at the Bartlett School of Environment Energy and Resources at University College London in England. She is also the principal investigator and project lead for the Re-Energize DR3 project. Her expertise ranges from theoretical investigations to implementation research and practice in energy, environment, resource nexus, risk assessment and resilience, and people, behavior, and response. As the head of the Islands Laboratory, Dr. Spataru coordinates a team of 11 researchers who study innovative solutions for islands that focus on a circular economy and assess trade-offs between resource use under different climatic conditions. Now, I would like to ask you, Catalina, to please activate your microphone and your camera, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I'm trying to share my screen now. And are you able to see it? Yeah, okay, great, wonderful. So I will briefly mention a little bit about the project. So Re-Energize DR3 project is formed of 32 researchers from 4 continents and 7 countries. And what we are really aiming to do is to address the simultaneous interaction between the climate-related natural disasters and development for effective disaster risk management. And we acknowledge the role of community involvement in the management planning and the role of legal principles and institutions in reducing those asymmetries in knowledge and power and society within a society. So what we are really doing is to build an integrated interdisciplinary approach we adopted to adaptive governance that includes this normative institutional dimension with cross stakeholders and cross scale interactions. We take qualitative and quantitative data into actionable insights for better disaster risk governance, and we apply different methods utilized across the consortium partner, informing each other and supporting each other. And the final product is really like a toolbox, as you see here, where we combine the quantitative methods with qualitative methods and methodological approach, values and principles, all of them interconnected. So if I simplify here, these are like the 4 interconnected main topics. So we have a diagnosis and the stakeholders processes. Then we have a social media and data processing. Then is the resource nexus and climate adaptation modeling scenarios. And then application to coastal cities and to islands. And what we are doing is we start to look at the global agendas, SDGs, climate change, and Sendai framework, and then we perform an analysis with diagnosis catalog, and then we define a balanced scorecard, and then in parallel we apply a process for stakeholders to derive information users, which could inform the social media modeling framework, and then we apply a triangulation, and then we identify the KPI for the DR3 best practices sectors, and that inform the resource nexus tool where we define different scenarios and looking at the trade-offs between resource use. And then we collect social media data from different locations and apply machine learning and sentiment analysis, so we can inform stakeholders engagement about specific application of a case studies. So we definitely have this kind of cumulative and in combination approach. At UCL, we develop a balanced scorecard for equitable DR3. We combine the 3 global agendas, SDGs, Sendai, and climate change adaptation mitigation. And we consider the 4 dimensions, finance, process, beneficiaries, learning, and innovation, each of that with a different number of indicators. We have so far 455 indicators, and we consider the gaps related to the resource nexus, water, energy, land, materials, and environmental justice in the context of resilience and in line with the 3 agendas. And what we did is we map the indicators relevant to resources in context of SDGs, including water, energy, food, land, and materials, and the 4 categories of environmental justice, which are the distribution of environmental harms and benefits, including resources, participation, which is participatory inequalities and inclusions, and capabilities, multidimension of well-being, and then recognition, which is individual right to self-recognition. So why we took this approach is because we wanted to expand the notions of relations between balanced scorecard dimensions and fairness, especially when addressing vulnerability and the trade-offs in context changing risk and resource allocation. So given the scorecard is a multidimensional and only some studies consider temporal aspects, our approach is novel because it has defined temporal time steps for all the categories. So, and in top of that is the different resources and dimensions and the agendas we included. So what we did is we used a multi-stakeholder theory of change where we included a number of steps and methods from stakeholder selection, mapping, process and engagement, and we adapted some of the existing methods to reflect the emphasis of our project on equitable DR3. So for validation of a toolbox and the balance scorecard and all the other tools we use in our toolbox, we develop a process for engagement, and we conducted a series of workshops and surveys with stakeholders in islands, in Fiji and Mauritius, in coastal cities, in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Maceió, and in Ghana in Accra. And what we did is we apply a policy Delphi to engage on validation of balanced scorecard gaps and identify issues involving resources and sectors and equitable DR3 governance. So we also ran a survey focusing on social media pre-emergency phases, cross-sectorial resilience and governance. We targeting islands from ODA DAC list. And we had 15 participating islands as well in the surveys. So what was really key aspect of this is to get validation of our approach with as many stakeholders as possible and their input as well, and to look at integration of 3 global agendas at the local level, the pre and post emergency phases, ranking of resources, the sectors and environmental justice dimensions and vulnerability dimensions as well. In each of a round of stakeholders in every location, we counted with a short questionnaire followed by a round of discussions. And then we apply an iterative process of discussion. We capture as many opposing and similar positions and reasoning through reactions and assessment of different views, and counting for the pros and cons of recommendations to advance equitable resilience and reduce disaster risk. So in here you see that we had stakeholders from a wide participatory groups, and all the stakeholders recognize the useful of our tool and approach to monitor and advance planning for disaster risk reduction. Participants also find the detailed 6-step useful approach to match local needs and overcome the high focus on post-emergency. The lack of comprehensive estimation of a budget allocated to disaster risk has been recognized in all by all of the stakeholders. In terms of shortage of indicators that enable the assessment of the effectiveness of adaptation actions in reducing climate risk also has been recognized by all the stakeholders. The dimensions of environmental justice were really considered very important for balanced scorecard across locations, including participation, social inequalities, distribution of environmental cost and the benefits, which is the allocation of resources and the different capabilities. And getting this whole picture of vulnerability is an issue across all locations, and most of them are not able to make advances in the area because of lack of capacity, lack of data and processes that are key to support this understanding. So that was very clear made also by the stakeholders. In parallel, we are running a household surveys also to develop, and that was developed with by our partners and with our help. And currently we are in the process of running the surveys in selected locations, looking at most vulnerable locations to floods and droughts in these locations. Two elements in particular play a really major role in the DR3 implementation, and that was the need to ensure an efficient exchange of information, data processes across stakeholders, groups, and participatory and equitable decision-making to influence the DR3 processes. And there is where the promise of artificial intelligence and machine learning to provide early warnings and verify reports in real time is duly significant, but we need to apply different methods to apply for that. So we collect the data from social media platforms by various partners, was the exercise done using artificial intelligence for digital response developed by Qatar Computing Research Institute. And we collected the data for different locations to try to understand the benefits of the social media. At UCL, what we did is we develop our own method for social media data analysis framework, because you can collect the data, but you have to do something with those data. So we use machine learning classifiers where filtering binary classifiers based on deep neural networks, and we train the machines and benchmark the data sets of disaster responses for various events there. And then with the development of a multi-class classification approach, we compare the state-of-the-art results in one of the benchmark data set containing the largest number of disaster-related categories. And then we built this classifier model for benchmarking data sets containing different disaster-related categories, and not only for droughts and floods and heat waves, but also earthquakes and other type of disasters. And then we develop further the method to analyze the social media data in multiple disaster-related collections of floods and heat waves. And then we propose methods using machine learning classifiers based on trained machines, and then we analyze a set of behavior indicators and match them with climate variables via decoding synoptical records to align behavior indicators along with climate variables to provide with additional valuable information, which can be considered in different phases of a disaster and applicable to extreme weather events. So we show also the transferability of this approach, which can be applied to any social media data collection. And we conducted the analysis in different collections. So as you see here in this figure, all the plots are aligned to the same point in time, starting from the top. The first and second plots show the count of positive messages and total activity messages in the same way as when we apply the sentiment analysis. And then we show the values of average air temperature, maximum temperature, precipitation, pressure, and relative humidity, and wind speed, and so on. And we find correlations between behavior and climate variables from the social media. And then a key aspect also
pardon
is
me,
the
Catalina,
resource
for
management.
interrupting, but it is time to wrap up now. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just to mention another important point is about actors and institutions. For this systematic transformation here is where we are looking at different scenarios to assess this in line with the stakeholders engagement process and the social media. So I will just wrap up this with some key findings from the stakeholders engagement. Definitely important integration of the three agendas, capacity building of all concerned institutions. The social vulnerability was context sensitive as well and based on the location, but getting really a whole picture for vulnerability is an issue across all locations, and especially there are no tools there really to be able to do that. And here is where we step in, and with our tool we can provide some of these insights.
Thank you, Catalina, especially for introducing everyone to the subject so thoroughly. It's now time to move on to our next speaker. So Catalina, if you would mute and close your camera. We'd like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Manta Devi Nabuth, an associate professor and head of the Civil Engineering Department at the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Mauritius in Mocha, Mauritius. She is a civil engineer by training and received a Master's of Science in Hydrology and Environmental Management from Imperial College, London. Manta completed her PhD in hydrogeology, pardon me for that, I'm not sure if that's misspelled, and undertook a postdoctoral research position with the United States Geological Survey in San Diego in the field of contaminant transport. Her research has focused on the water sector, examining climate-related hazards such as flood and drought, and she has established a good local network with institutions concerned with these problems and has worked with a much more extensive network of organizations in Southern Africa. Dr. Nabuth, if you would please activate your camera and microphone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. So my focus here would be on the impacts of climate change, especially from a small island perspective, and in particular, the flood problem. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, just to put everybody in perspective, so the island of Mauritius, the island itself is located in the southern Indian Ocean. Okay, it's about 2 kilometers off the east coast of the Republic of Madagascar. But the island itself is small, it's an isolated island, and it is considered as a high island because it is characterized by a central plateau surrounded by coastal plains. And by the nature of it, there are vulnerable areas. And the island itself has got is 45 kilometers in width and 65 kilometers in length, and it has 330 kilometers of coastline. And the coastline is really a prime area for us, and also highly vulnerable. Next one, please. Okay. Now, with regards to climate change, the island has always been visited by cyclones. So we have had major disasters related to cyclones. But at the same time, what we've noted is that recently the problem of floods has been growing. And in 2013, we actually had the most deadly flood event which the island had witnessed. And this was caused with 150 millimeters of continuous torrential rain, which fell within 2 hours only. And it occurs in a place which has a small catchment, whereby it is surrounded by mountains and then close to the sea also. So within that small area, we had that much of rainfall, and this was really very a big disaster for us. And this situation has not recurred after a few years because we have learned how to take precautions, but the problems of torrential rain has still been recorded. And more recently, in 2021, the island recorded flash floods in the southern eastern part, okay, after recording 400 millimeters of rainfall in 1 day, 24 hours. And this particular event resulted in landslide problems in many areas. So this small map of Mauritius is actually indicating the flood, the landslide prone areas. This was a study which was carried out for the country, and already the island is experiencing landslide problems, and some sites are particularly prone by the nature of the slope and all that, but they can induce serious landslide after heavy rainfall events. So it's not only the floods, it's also the consequence of the flood which are inducing or increasing the risk of landslide. Next one, please. So this is one of the recent map which has been published for Mauritius, and it shows location of flood-prone areas. In fact, 290 sites were recorded in 2021. Now it has increased slightly more, and it was noted then that 48 sites were high-risk areas. And if you observe the map properly, you can see that it's really spread over the island. It's not like only close to the sea or only in certain zones. It's really spread out. And there are many causes for problems of flood in Mauritius. First of all, we will attribute that to the increasing intensity of rainfall, longer duration of high intensity rainfall events, which was not the case in the past. Unfortunately, inadequate drainage capacity at certain places, blocked drains. Okay, it's not only due to lack of maintenance, but whenever there is flood, it's accompanied with debris like branches. So these easily block drains, open drains. So consequently, there are problems which arise. Changes in practice. Okay, I don't know how common this is, but in many cases, mechanization of agricultural lands have really changed the practice. So where water was contained within those areas, nowadays it's no longer being contained. So it moves to the low areas, and low areas are the areas where often we found construction there. Unfortunately, another point is construction in floodplains, at times unknowingly that you're constructing in floodplains. We have also noted some cases whereby there were river overflows because of soil erosion, eventually ending up as sediments in riverbeds, and this caused river overflows. Storm management so far has not been addressed at catchment level. It was addressed mostly at the level of a project, but this is a practice which is changing now. So the situation with our experience, bad experience, I would say, is forcing us to learn to do otherwise. Next slide, please. Okay, now with regards to hazards and vulnerability, a recent study has noted that Mauritius is at risk to 41 types of hazard, not only natural hazard, chemical also, and as well as technological. So the 41 types include all of them. Now, when a disaster strikes, being a small island, it affects the whole island. And being an isolated island, we can't really rely on neighbors to help us. So isolated island have to learn how to adapt to situation, because it can get really bad for the whole island, for the people, for the economy also of the island. Now, after cyclones, because cyclones is one of the hazards, natural hazards, which have been visiting the island since long, very long, I would say. Flooding is now the second largest risk, okay, after cyclones. Now, with regards to the Land Drainage Authority, like I mentioned, there are so many sites, but the World Risk Index ranking, which is interesting, showing that we have been improving, because at the level of the country, we have been taking many measures, so there has been improvement, but still the vulnerability, I would say, is very high, because we are still being faced by very severe hazards, unfortunately, which are increasing year by year. Okay, next one, please. Now, another area which is very important for a small island is the coastal zone. Now, coastal erosion is a concern for the island, a major concern, because as an island, the tourism sector represents a strong economic pillar. And the ocean resources, in addition, contribute to the livelihood of many. So there are many causes, okay, These are cyclones, marine pollution, and coastal protection has been ongoing in Mauritius, many different types. Many of them have worked, many of them have not worked, but there has been economic implication, financial implication. So nowadays, there are lots of discussion about nature-based solution. And in some coastal villages, relocation has been an option. Next one, please. So for the DR3 project, we have considered one of the coastal zone, which is the Rivière des Galets, Chemin Grenier. Why is it that? Because it's a coastal village, and this village has been experiencing flood from inland and also from the sea, storm surge. So it's at very high risk. And the villages are located at low elevation. Next one, please. So there has been some study that we carried out with regards to shoreline analysis, and we've taken historical satellite imagery to confirm those areas where there are erosion and accretion. And next one, please. So we have also conducted a number of field surveys with people with the villages, and we've noted that storm surge are experienced fairly regularly, at least once a year, or at times free during a year. So people have confirmed the sites and information about wave heights and how storm surge impacts severely on livelihood. Next one, please. Okay, and in addition, we've conducted household survey, and we have seen that people report that flood problems are becoming increasingly severe over time. Okay, and at times floodwater lasts for between 1 and 3 hours, and in other cases up to 6 hours. This is severe, but unfortunately, community engagement still seems to be on the weak side, because so far we feel that there is more top-down approach and there is a need for bottom-up approach, and people are not very clear about what can they do to alleviate the situation, to reduce the risk. Okay, so with that, next one, please. I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
Manta, thank you ever so much, and especially thank you for keeping to time. You're perfect, and for showing us the detail of what we often only just see on the news here in the United States, where I live, to get a much clearer idea of just how devastating floods and storms are to the vulnerable populations in Mauritius. So thank you so much for that. And I'll now ask that we have our next speaker coming up. Our third speaker is Cameron McBroom-Fitterer. Cameron is a second-year master's student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Department of City and Regional Planning, where he specializes in land use and environmental planning, focusing on climate adaptation and resilience planning. Before attending UNC, Cameron earned a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. His experience growing up and living in Miami informed his interest in studying effective and innovative responses to changing climatic conditions and natural hazards. Cameron joined the UNC Re-Energized team led by Professor Felix Dodds in June of this year. Later this month, he will begin an internship with the Federal Emergency Management Agency known as FEMA in the United States, Office of Response and Recovery. Cameron is joined by Re-Energize DR3 teammate Alex Chentelas, an undergraduate student studying English and comparative literature and food studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Alex's academic and professional interests include environmental justice, storytelling, politics, and food systems. Alex joined the UNC Re-Energized team in December 2021 and has also held internships with the Orleans Public Defenders in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the Stronger Stories Agency in Lewes, England. He was selected to co-curate TEDx's 2021 UNC conference, leading a team in collaboration with Innovative Carolina. So I would now like to hand the floor to Cameron and to Alex. Gentlemen, please activate your cameras and microphones. You have the floor.
Thanks, Charles. Hi, everyone. As Charles mentioned, I'm a recent addition to the UNC Water Institute's Re-Energized team led by Felix Dodds. The presentation I'm going to share today Addressing Disaster Vulnerability at a Global Scale, is a synthesis of some of the good research that my teammates, both past and present, have conducted here at Carolina in conjunction with our partner universities. So I'm very happy to be able to share this brief summary with you and excited to build on and add to this work in the coming year. So just a quick overview of what I'll cover today. First, just some general background and context about our work related to vulnerability and outreach events that we've participated in recently. Then we'll look at 3 existing vulnerability indices within the UN system. And then lastly, we'll examine some key takeaways about how these indices can evolve, improve, or inspire future work, as well as consider some questions that we think are integral to future efforts. So here's a quote on the climate crisis from the UN Secretary General, given in December 2020. Manta highlighted this quote as well in the beginning of her presentation, but as always, the impacts fall most heavily on the world's most vulnerable people. Those who have done the least to cause the problem are suffering the most. Even in the developed world, the marginalized are the first victims of disasters and the last to recover. So the central question we want to examine here, and a question our team has begun to explore, is this: how should we address disaster vulnerability at the regional and global levels in a way that is also applicable at the local level? Now, this isn't an easy question by any means, and unfortunately, I can't say to you that our team has found a clear answer. Rather, what we hope to do is start a conversation around what steps might be taken to find more clarity, and to raise some points that might help guide discussions in a productive manner, hopefully leading to the creation of improved ways to gauge vulnerability at a broad scale. The US Re-Energized team has been studying the governance of disasters in the US at the federal, state, and local levels, using the state of North Carolina as a general case study. Through a series of stakeholder workshops, a key finding was that no global vulnerability index exists for vulnerable groups. And so the team wanted to examine this finding more closely, noting that there is an existing need for a broader and more coherent approach to vulnerability indices. They partnered with the International Science Council, or ISC, who have helped engage with academics and practitioners to complement existing UN processes. With the ISC, our team presented at this year's UN Disaster Risk Reduction Conference in Bali, Indonesia. Our project lead, Felix Dodds, then presented this work last month at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Bonn, Germany. Today, we are bringing this work and the conversation to the HLPF in order to gain further insight and feedback. So now let's look at some of the existing indices that have been used to measure vulnerability in the UN system. The first that I'll discuss is the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index, known as the EVI. This index was designed in the year 2000. It was revised in 2005, and it's reviewed every 3 years. It's one of the earliest vulnerability indices operating at a regional and global level. Since 2005, the EVI has served as one of the 3 criteria that the UN Committee for Development Policy has used to identify and graduate nations designated as least developed countries, or LDCs. The index utilizes 8 indicators and considers 2 dimensions of vulnerability. As its name suggests, these dimensions are economic and environmental dimensions. The methodology behind the index has been agreed upon during review sessions, and the index contains data from 143 countries that date back to the year 2000. This breadth of coverage, 143 countries, all the way back almost 20 years, over 20 years, is considered a key strength. Next, we'll look at the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, or MVI. The MVI was created specifically with small island developing states in mind following a directive from the UN General Assembly in December of 2020. The MVI expands on the existing framework of the EVI. It utilizes 11 indicators as opposed to 8, and increases the EVI's 2 dimensions of vulnerability to 4. In the case of the MVI, financial and geographic factors are added in. The MVI uses publicly available data sourced from the EVI and the World Bank, and despite its focus on small island developing states, the MVI is still applicable globally as it includes data that covers 126 countries. One development that has sparked some interest from our team is work being conducted by the UN Office of the High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States. This office has proposed linking the MVI to factors of resilience, using dimensions of structural vulnerability and structural and policy resilience. We think that this work can be a promising step forward in both comprehensiveness and integration as we move forward. So now just a quick comparison. We can just quickly glance at a summarized comparison of the EVI and MVI and see kind of how vulnerability index work has progressed in the last 20 years or so. But next, I want to highlight an example of an index that targets a vulnerable group with more specificity as opposed to the EVI and MVI, which are kind of more general indices. So here we have an overview of UNICEF's Children's Climate Risk Index, or CCRI. It's an index that was designed to measure the vulnerability of children around the world. The CCRI was developed just recently in 2021 and is divided into two pillars. The first pillar, which is illustrated by this diagram on the left, considers exposure to climate and environmental shocks and stresses. This includes natural hazards like tropical cyclones, as well as other occurrences such as air pollution and water security. The second pillar, illustrated on the right, is where vulnerability comes into play. This pillar addresses poverty, communication assets and social protection, water, sanitation and hygiene, education, and health and nutrition. So let's move ahead to key takeaways and what we believe we have learned from having looked at existing indices in conjunction with stakeholder workshops. So first, we think that the index I just discussed, UNICEF CCRI, might be used as a template for additional indices that focus on other vulnerable groups and or marginalized groups. These might include indigenous populations, people with disabilities, aging populations, or a host of others. Second, the indices should be developed that are truly regional in nature and their applicability. In general, we believe that indicators need to be customized by region to capture local dimensions and better reflect the needs of local vulnerable populations. Third, factors of peace and security are missing from current indices. The COP27 presidency emphasized this point as critical, especially within the context of African countries. And finally, our overarching takeaway is that the current UN system approach to vulnerability is made up of fragmented processes. We believe that further coordination, conversation, and collaboration that leverages existing vulnerability work could be key to elevating the power and utility of indices while preventing further fragmentation. And so lastly, I want to leave you all with a set of questions that Felix raised last month at the UNFCCC in Bonn. First, which dimensions of vulnerability should be considered? Second, when we think about data sources, one, what is currently available? Two, what more is needed on this front? And lastly, is the data we're looking at regionally specific? Third, how might countries learn from one another using methods such as benchmarking and peer review? Fourth, how can we integrate current and future indices into regional and global processes? And lastly, how can this process be used to identify specific policies and approaches that build community resilience, especially in the context of vulnerable groups? Thank you all so much for your time. I'm looking forward to engaging in the continued discussion around this work and hearing your questions and comments. Thanks, everyone.
Cameron, thank you so very much for that, for going into great detail about the team's work, and especially for keeping to time, because we have some very great questions already in the Q&A box. So we want to give an opportunity for the panelists to address those questions to the benefit of our attendees. Now, our fourth speaker is Farrar Kabir, who has been working with Action Aid Bangladesh as the country director since June 2007. Nearly 3 decades of vast experience in the field of development and research has made her a renowned human rights advocate and a climate justice defender at home and abroad, with an uncompromising voice against human rights violation. Farah is engaged with multiple national and international professional societies. She is a member of the advisory committee of Bangladesh's NDA to the Green Climate Fund, a member of Child Rights Committee National Human Rights Commission, and a board member of UCEP, to name just a few. She was the chair of Global Board of the Global Network of Disaster Risk Reduction for 2 terms from 2015 to 2021, board member of Climate Action Network South Asia since 2019, and advisory committee member of Women's Economic Empowerment, WEE. Farah, please unmute your microphone and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm in a place where electricity is fluctuating, so hopefully I will not miss out on the session, but I appreciate this opportunity to speak to and share my thoughts with all of you. I can't put the video on, I don't know. So as I don't have a presentation, maybe that will not be a problem. So I'm representing ActionAid, which is a global federation, and it has members from 45 countries, and we reach out to about 15 million people from communities and grassroots, including refugees and people living in conflict. It turned 50 this year. It's a 50-year-old organization. Now, you know, 2015 often we think is a historical year, as the world adopted the Agenda 2030, Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, Finance for Development, and then in 2016, the Agenda for Humanity. These were all important global moments. However, when we try and look at the world today, it didn't prepare us for a pandemic. We had no clue there would be a pandemic. And we are facing disasters which at a rate of 40% increase. And according to recent UN convention conferences, all the international commitments are off track. It will take at least 30 plus years to achieve the SDGs and for the realization of all other agreements. Now then this then begs the question, can women, girls, persons with special needs, young people wait for another 30 years? Can governments wait for another 30 years? I mean, this is something that we are being faced with. The world's context, as I was saying, when Sendai and DRR for DRR was agreed in 2015, we didn't anticipate the pandemic. And then if you look at 2021, the worst news from most of the time was, other than the pandemic, was related to stress and climate change. The first 6 months of 2022, we could see similar pattern, drought, floods, heat waves, and so on. So we need to prepare. And when in this conversation today, we really need to talk about how to face today's reality and work with the disproportionately affected communities, and none of us are actually safe. There's no reason for any one of us to feel that we can remain comfortable. And then if I bring your attention to the first question about adaptive governance capabilities at national, subnational, and local levels, it's important that if to understand both how DRR is being, or disaster risk governance is understood. It is the systems of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks and other arrangements that guide, coordinate, and oversee disaster risk reduction. It's related to good governance, and it expects that governance will be, you know, these systems and all will be transparent, inclusive, collective, and efficient to reduce the existing disaster risks and avoid creating new ones. Well, there's a big question. I'm not sure we've managed to avoid. How disaster risk reduction governance can benefit the most vulnerable can only be understood if we understand vulnerability. And vulnerability to disasters are gendered and socially constructed. Women, persons with special needs, young people, people living in grassroots and far to reach area are doubly vulnerable. And it is, you know, when we talk about risks, we have to understand the perspective of most of the vulnerable, considering the context they live in, which is social, political, institutional, environmental, economic, cultural, and so on. And in terms of this context, important to understand whether it is rural, urban, and it can get further broken down. So it's important to understand these layers and understand these different analysis to be able to come up with good governance. Understand disaster or event, how it impacts negatively people. In that case, even for instance, in the same country, in Bangladesh, for instance, people in the rural areas or in Ethiopia or in Haiti, people with less resources will be affected more than those who are well off, who have the financial means to deal with some of this. So we can't come up with any approach or any mechanism without understanding these layers. We need to be able to limit the global temperature, which means emissions. And so far, we have not been successful. There's no way we are getting to that 2 or 1.5 degree. One of the recent reports by WMO says that there's a 50-50 chance that we will cross the 1.5 degree threshold within the next 5 years, which means more catastrophes, conflicts, and hunger and food insecurity. And this has been with the Ukraine war, this situation has become even more complex. And this conflict, food insecurity, drought, floods lead to mass migration, increased gender-based violence, increased inequality, and other health issues. So our aim, therefore, should not be just to talk about an adaptive governance, but transformative governance. It is critical to know that we need to work together at national, local level, but also at regional level. For instance, reducing risk and building resilience in the Nile River, the Nile Delta, the Ganges, Brahmaputra Delta, the Mekong Delta. The development planning is often top-down, trying to achieve political commitment into reality that is contingent on multiple factors, but not necessarily prioritizing the most vulnerable. And it's not always transformative, but we need transformative risk reduction capacity, which we should not take for granted exists among the policymakers or the bureaucracy or in institutions, and which is exactly why we have seen the dragging of decisions, you know, how slow policies have been forthcoming that are relevant. Climate, conflict, humanitarian development intersectionality is not necessarily understood by all our policymakers, our decision makers, even now. There is, since the IPCC report, a greater attention to conflict, stress, and issues of resilience are being discussed, but we still have a long way to go. People must lead the planning where think tanks, bureaucrats, policymakers can understand the importance of the reality of today. Now, if we were to compare developed and developing countries, before it was like, okay, they have all the power, they have the systems, they have the infrastructure, they have the money, they can address these disasters much faster than all of us. But climate change in some ways has clearly, and the pandemic has opened our eyes that sense of security is false. The vulnerability can be equally high in different parts of the world. The key differences between developed and developing countries that influences the governance approaches are economic status, technological advancement, social structure. Developed countries do have a stronger economy, but I think now we can see how that is also being shaken, and better infrastructure to address some of these disasters. Whereas the LDCs, small island countries are exposed on a much higher level to these issues. Society-led protection systems, strong community cohesion, low-led designing of disaster governance is what the LDCs and countries in the south celebrate. For instance, in Bangladesh, we used to have death by cyclone and floods in hundreds of thousands, whereas now, with our early warning system, cyclone preparedness, we have really brought it down. So there are incremental celebrations. There are certain preparations that have led to a reduction in the disasters and the outcomes of the disasters. But we cannot forget that these disasters, the vulnerability and the governance issues are all entwined because of the vested interest, because of the absence of equity, because of realization of the need to take climate change and transition much more seriously. Our recommendation, therefore, would be that we recognize that climate change and green transitions are not something to be thought of in the next 5-10 years. It's today. We have to act today. And to be able to do that, we have to recognize that in society, there are gaps in policy, planning, and budget for the most vulnerable. We have to recognize the value of contributions of community-based adaptation and mitigation, the contributions of women, the young people, and we have to prepare with them. We need to establish effective implementation and monetary mechanisms. We also need to ensure that the climate finance is there. It seems that you can mobilize finance when there is a conflict or war, but it takes decades to mobilize finance to address issues of climate change and its impacts. So this is where we need to see global leadership and commitment, and we have to do much more greater collective advocacy. Otherwise, the governance in terms of disaster risk reduction and approaches and institution buildings will not meet our aspirations. And more than the aspirations, we just have one planet. It begs the question whether we'll still be able to continue living. Business as usual is not going to work. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Farah, thank you so very much. And thank you for keeping to time. We do need to move on, so I'll ask that we do bring on our next speaker, and that our fifth speaker is Rebecca Murphy, also known as Becky, who holds a master's in disasters adaptation and development from King's College London University and a first-class BSc geography degree from the University of Reading, specializing her thesis on climate change adaptation. She is currently the acting interim co-executive director for the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, where her substantive role is policy lead, heading up policy and advocacy, membership engagement, and external communications teams for the UNDRR. Rebecca is also co-chair of the UNDRR Stakeholder Engagement Mechanism and co-chair of the NGO major group within the SEM. She has spent over 10 years working as a resilience and disaster risk technical advisor for humanitarian teams, including an Action Aid, Christian Aid, and CAFOD. Becky, I'd ask you to activate your camera and microphone, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone from New York. Firstly, thank you very much for this important session and for the opportunity to contribute. And I'd really like to echo some of those important messages that Farah just shared. For those less familiar with disaster reduction, we are the largest international network of civil society organizations working on disaster reduction. Currently, we have 1,436 members organizations across 127 countries and growing. With that, just very quickly, the UNDRR Stakeholder Engagement Mechanism, the SEM, is a very important space in governance of risk reduction. It's really where all non-state actors have the opportunity to feed into the implementation and the monitoring of the Sendai framework. The SEM was established back in 2019 and today has over 200 members and is made up of 17 constituencies, the majority of which are civil society and local organisations. So a really key kind of formal but open space to feed into the UN processes. So very recently, the SEM hosted a stakeholder forum at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Indonesia. And here our SEM declarations fed directly into the co-chair summary, the Bali Agenda for Resilience. And we feel there are some really important messages that we would like to thread through from the global platform and the regional platforms around disaster risk reduction into the high-level political forum and the Sustainable Development Goals, because they really do link through, and it's important that we're connecting the different frameworks. So at the GPDRR, the SEM called for an all-of-government approach to ensure an all-of-society approach to risk reduction and resilience. So today, and at HLPF, we are really trying to take that one step further and call for an all-of-United Nations approach to enable this all-of-government and all-of-society approach for the level of risk-informed development that's required to really reach and maintain the SDG targets in our current global context of increasing and systemic risk and vulnerability. So we know that risk is increasing, and we know we've heard some really key messages from FAR and others on vulnerability. We know that the poorest and most marginalized are on the front line of that risk and are bearing the brunt of the cascading impacts of COVID-19, climate change and conflict and the ripple effects that they are having. One of the pieces of work that UNDRR does is called Views from the Frontline. This is our flagship piece of work where we collect views from communities on the front line of risk in 50 high-risk countries from across the globe. And our VFL work continues to evidence this increasing level of risk. Linked to this, we have a programme called Local Leadership for Global Impact, which aims to champion local voice and urge global decision makers to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind in the global COVID recovery. So to really listen to local recommendations, local knowledge, local voice, and include local actors in decision making. We know that COVID-19 has reversed progress on all of the SDGs. We've heard that last week at HLPF, and I'm sure we'll hear it more this week as well. From our communities in the front line of risk, we are hearing that climate change is really being felt and described as a super risk driver by our communities. And GNDR recognised then the cascading impact of conflict like that in Ukraine and the impact that that has had on things like food security across the globe. So here at HLPF, we're calling on decision makers at all levels of governance to recognise this level of urgency and really push this level of urgency for risk-informed sustainable development, and clearly demonstrate how that second half of the Agenda 2030 will address the increasing kind of systemic nature of risk and support that all of Agenda 2030 framework to make sure that any development is risk-informed and is threaded across the humanitarian development peace nexus. So in the lead up to the recent Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, we put together a stakeholder engagement mechanism declaration based on this local knowledge, this local voice, the lived realities that we were hearing from our communities on the front line of risk, and came out with 8 specific call to action recommendations that we'd like to see threaded through into pieces of work like this, analysing, understanding vulnerability, but also going forward as we strengthen the SDGs in the second half of the implementation of the 2030 agendas. So we felt that these are really important messages that need to be taken into the SDGs. So I'm going to run you through the 8 very quickly, and then offer some recommendations for how we can strengthen this going forward as well. So first of all, the key message that was coming out from our members in the Global South is to listen to communities. So our primary call is to listen to the community, to those on the front line of risk, the first responders. Those living in communities on the front line of risk have the local knowledge, the expertise, the capacity to significantly strengthen risk governance in policy and in practice. And one of GNDR's projects on local leadership for global action has really demonstrated the power of local-led risk-informed interventions in preparing for and preventing disasters. We know that localization must be championed not just in the Sendai framework, but across and into the SDGs and all of the 2030 framework agendas as well, if it's going to be meaningful, if it's going to be sustainable. Next, and linked to this, is the importance of investing at the local level. So prioritise making sure risk reduction finance, both public and private, really reaches that local level. Empower and finance locally led grassroots action and include local leaders in decision-making spaces at local, national and global levels on where and how that finance should be spent. Third, our members are calling for improved coordination and coherence, and particularly recognising civil society as being that enabler to lead the coordination and coherence required for risk-informed development and that all of society approach. So recognise the role that civil society organisations have to lead that collaboration and empower them and support them. Our fourth key area is the importance of empowering women leaders, and we heard a bit about this from Farah just now. So we really are calling both with GNDR and the stakeholder engagement mechanism to recognise and tackle gender inequality as a driver of risk. Recognise that gender inequality is a barrier to achieving our Agenda 2030 targets across all of them. And we must empower women leaders to meaningfully engage in decision making at all levels. Our fifth area is the importance of strengthening DRR governance in conflict-affected states. We've seen the cascading impact of conflict on risk and vulnerability, and those on the front line of this risk in fragile states specifically call on the global community to implement risk governance and support conflict-affected and fragile states to implement risk reduction and risk-informed development governance policy and plans within their fragile context and support them to do that in a meaningful way. Next, and we've heard a little bit about this already, is the importance of youth, children and youth. So our stakeholder engagement mechanism really highlighted the importance of a multi-generational action for risk reduction and risk-informed development, and the need to really meaningfully include children and youth leaders in all levels of decision making. Next, something we've heard a lot about in the last week at HLPF is this need to learn from COVID-19 and understand and address the weaknesses in governance that COVID-19 demonstrated, and increase, one of the recommendations that we have is this need to increase the number of UN member states equipped with quality multi-stakeholder DRR governance that includes civil society representation and adequately reflects all parts of society for risk-informed development. So we see within the UN system, the different kind of bodies have a stakeholder engagement mechanism, but we're really calling on the member states as well to open up and to bring in civil society, bring in, relevant SEM structures to make sure the all of society approach is really there and is really structured and embedded in risk governance going forward. And last but absolutely not least is the importance of integrating inclusion across all levels and transition from seeing inclusion as a standalone topic. So recognise the intersectional dynamics of marginalisation in relation to risk and meaningfully integrate inclusion across all the areas of the 2030 agenda frameworks. So you can read a bit more in depth about these recommendations in a couple of places. So first of all, we have a global report on civil society reflections of the Sendai midterm review. So a real stock taking moment where our GNDR members stopped and looked at the progress of this very important Sendai framework midterm review point. You can see that on our website, so gndr.org, if you just go to the resources tab. And you can also see this on Prevention Web. If you look at the UNDRR SEM, you'll see our formal declaration, which really pulls out key messages on the importance of implementing the whole of government approach, promoting localization, ensuring local financing, and making sure that we're leaving no one behind and learning from the governance failures that we saw in COVID-19 and the successes that were demonstrated as well. So to finish, PF, the UNDRR SEM is really calling on global decision makers and member states and fellow civil society organisations to take this further and really integrate meaningfully local voice, local knowledge and expertise into all of the SDG work, really for meaningful risk-informed development. Listen to those recommendations being made at the local level and meaningfully include those on the front line of risk of decision making. Otherwise, we're not going to tackle this really important issue of vulnerability, of risk governance, and achieve and sustain the SDGs. And I hand back to you.
Becky, thank you ever so much. And Becky, if it's not too much trouble, if you could put a link to that document and other resources in the chat box, we'll share that with everybody. So thank you so much. Before we move on to our final speaker, I would just like to remind the participants, especially those who came in a little bit later, if you would like to have the access to the video recording to share with others, and also to the resources that are being put into the chat box, please put your name and email address in the chat box, because we didn't have a registration process for this. So we haven't captured everyone's details. So please do put your details in the chat box, and we'll send out information to those of you who do. So Becky, thank you so much for that. I'll ask you to turn off your camera and mic, and I'll introduce our sixth and final speaker. It is Taryn Quayle, a professional officer at ICLEI Africa, working across climate adaptation, water, sanitation, disaster risk reduction, and nature for over 15 years. Taryn has managed and implemented numerous water, sanitation, and climate resilience projects over her time with ICLEI, which is, of course, the local governments for sustainability organization. That work includes a multi-country water and climate project that focuses on climate risk and vulnerability assessments, disaster risk reduction assessments and strategy development, water and sanitation asset mapping and management, cost-benefit analysis, institutional mapping, policy review, financial mechanisms assessments, and the development of local water and sanitation action plans in several African cities. Taryn has many years of experience in applying co-production approaches and fostering multi-level governance approaches to enhance dialogue and cooperation for improved governance within the thematic areas in which she works. So Taryn, I'll hand the floor over to you. Please activate your microphone and your camera. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by just providing you a brief introduction of what ICLEI is for those who may not be familiar with us. So ICLEI is the world's oldest and largest network of cities, with a global network of more than 2,500 local and regional governments working together to promote sustainable development. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to really kind of share some of the methodologies and the materials that have been developed by ICLEI over the past 30 years, working with cities in developing risk assessments, local disaster management strategies, resilience and climate change action plans. ICLEI is a core member of the UNDRR Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. And as part of that campaign, we're really pleased to see that we're moving from dialogue and from discourse more towards implementation and action on the ground, and to really see how we can support cities and all levels of government in ensuring that climate change is really embedded across all departments and it's not a standalone, and that we can really embed resilient and sustainable development at the local level. I think we've heard many times today that climate change is a multi-sectoral issue. It affects all of us in multiple ways, and thus we really need integrated and systemic approaches to tackle this. With that being said, multi-level governance is pivotal to ICLEI's approach in working with cities and harnessing cross-scale multidisciplinary relationships, which are needed for inclusive governance and decision-making at the local level. This whole of government approach is needed, whereby we bring in ministries, public administrations, public agencies to ensure that they're aligning their efforts in order to achieve maximum effectiveness, and that we also bring in civil society organizations and communities to ensure that our planning is inclusive from the outset. Collaborative governance can really improve municipal planning and local planning and increase the resilience of cities to the impacts of climate change and numerous social development challenges. At ICLEI, this approach is mainstreamed across all of our work, and we would encourage those who are interested in multi-level governance to have a look at ICLEI's recent publications, which include a guide to implementing multi-level governance in action. We know that this is one of the most indispensable tools we have in fostering national and national resilience and to strengthening multi-level governance collaboration, which really should be the first step when addressing local climate resilient development. I'd like to share a bit about one of our flagship projects called UNDRR, which stands for Urban Natural Assets for Africa. And I'll also share a link in the chat to some of these materials. But the UNDRR project has been active in 10 cities in 8 countries for close to 10 years now. And the aim of the program originally was to integrate nature into urban planning to foster local resilience. The latest project of the UNDRR program is looking at UNDRR resilience, so resilience for urban natural assets, and how we can bring in a human rights-based approach into our urban projects to really ensure that we're addressing the needs of the whole of society, in particular vulnerable groups in our cities. And fundamental to this approach is really understanding what the socioeconomic drivers are at the local level that present both barriers and opportunities to building resilience at the local level. This program has developed a variety of tools and process documents that can be used when developing local risk assessments and strategy development to improve urban planning. And some of the key pillars that have been developed in terms of process documents include looking at how we can examine alternative planning approaches that are tailor-made to local contexts and not a one-size-fits-all. To also look at local planning approaches that are specific to developing countries rather than imported from developed countries. We have other documents and handbooks that look at how we can work with both formal and informal governance structures and the critical need to include both of these in dialogues. This comes from when we're working with communities, when we're working with city structures and also with the private sector to really understand what the formal and the informal governance structures are and how they can be incorporated into the dialogue for inclusive planning. There's also quite a lot of materials about how you can promote co-production and multi-level governance from the outset, using creative tools and methodologies to include communities in planning and implementation, such as Minecraft and urban tinkering. We have a number of projects which we did in Addis where we used Minecraft to really involve women and vulnerable groups in planning nature-based resilient projects on the ground, and to allow them to fully participate in the planning process, the implementation and the design process, and using mechanisms such as urban tinkering, which is looking at small experiments that can be done in an urban landscape to make scalable change across a city. We've also got a number of mechanisms and methodologies that are used to foster trust and build relationships using innovative and interactive exercises, and also to create spaces for reflection and effective dialogue, including ensuring power dynamics are taken into account, especially when we're looking at fostering inclusive planning. In addition to these tools and mechanisms that have been developed as part of the UNDRR program, ICLEI, together with the UNDRR, has also supported 50 cities in Africa to apply the disaster risk reduction scorecards for cities, which were developed as part of the Making Cities Resilient campaign. And these scorecards essentially provide the opportunity to work with cities both virtually and in person to ensure that cities have access to key data and provide a baseline for risk management in their city. I think it's been mentioned several times today that access to and management of data is one of the fundamental challenges that we have across all levels of governments, but especially at the local level. And so undertaking these detailed baseline assessments actually provides a point of departure for cities to coordinate resilience interventions across different sectors and identify what the gaps and opportunities are at the local level. The scorecard operates on essentially 10 pillars or 10 essentials. So it looks firstly at what plans exist currently in the city, what kind of assessment of risk there is at the local level, so undertaking a hazard assessment, looking at how cities can strengthen their financial capacity, looking at how nature-based solutions can be used to leverage resilience at the local level, reviewing the institutional capacity of the city, understanding the society's capacity for resilience, undertaking an assessment of infrastructure at the local level, and then finally identifying specific disaster risk reduction responses that can be implemented at the city level. So the scorecard that was applied in the 50 cities in Africa can also be found on the Making Cities Resilient dashboard, which is available through the UNDRR, and just provides you an overview of the methodology which has been trialed in many, many cities across the world, and has also provided a baseline for developing local disaster risk reduction strategies. That's just a very, very short overview of some of the mechanisms and methodologies that we've used when we're trying to promote inclusive planning. And I will add links to all of those documents in the chat below. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taryn, and certainly thank you for putting that link in the chat box, and we'll share that information with those who give us their contact details. Now, if I could suggest that we'd have a few minutes for questions and answers. Cameron, if you could drop the screen sharing away, and if I could ask all of our participants to activate their cameras for the moment. Anyone who would like to address any of the questions. And Cameron, perhaps we'll change to gallery view so that the recording picks up everybody. What I would like to, I said we have a couple questions. Let me just begin by suggesting that I'll read off the first question, and it's sort of a general question, and maybe just ask one of you one or two of you to answer it so that we have time for other questions. And the first question that came in, well, this from a person who's no longer in the attendees, is I know that Mexico was not included in your approach, and therefore the sarcasm problem is not being addressed by our work. Now, it's a pretty general question, and obviously that person doesn't know the extent of the work. Would anyone like to address that matter regarding a specific country?
I can mention, Charles. So in our project, we focus on coastal cities and islands, and we started with Accra in Ghana, and with a couple of cities in Brazil, and then in terms of islands, we started with Mauritius and Fiji. And from there, we extended our research to other islands and engaging with stakeholders on those 15 other islands. It's limited. Every research has limited. To be honest, we can't do everything, and each community is different. So we had to pick up locations which has some similarities there, so we can make sense of our research.
Thank you. Now, the second question from colleague Richard Jordan, it's addressed to Catalina, but I think it may be something that others would want to comment on as well. How were older persons consulted in your process? Not all disabled are older, and vice versa. Take the first stab at that, Catalina.
Yeah, absolutely. We consider number, so 13 groups of stakeholders. So the major groups, we have youth and children, NGOs, women, indigenous peoples, local authorities, trade unions, businesses and industries, community science and technological, volunteers, people with disabilities, older people, and education communities. So these were the 13 categories we consider, and that is based on the major groups from the UN documents and from SDGs documents.
Thank you, Catalina. We do have another, there's another question just came in. There actually are a couple of statements within the Q&A box from a person who didn't actually ask a question, and that person is no longer attending. So why don't we move on to the question that just came in. It's for Ahab. It says, Bangladesh was a great example of soft approaches could reduce disaster impacts, especially through early warning and low-cost measures. How has this changed given the recent rising impacts? Harad, do you want to take a stab at that?
Thank you. Yes, you know, we celebrate that, as I had earlier mentioned, that early warning, preparedness, volunteer development, all this has been possible. And this has been effective at the community level by engaging community. We have the CPB models and putting women and young people at the center of these actions. So it's become a part of policy that's also in terms of local government, or the civil society and NGOs and INGOs have taken this forward. Now, I think the second part of the question was impact. How is it, you know, we are a lower riparian country, we're a delta. And whatever measures we take, we are impacted by the climate change beyond our ability and capacity. Recently in Sylhet, in southeast of Bangladesh, we have in 1 month have had 2 rounds of floods. And all the preparedness we had, we had the shelters, early warning, people were being moved. It's not going to help because the communities have lost their livelihood, have lost their home. Children have not been able to go to school. There are health issues. Women are missing out, in terms of the families are breaking down to some extent. Men are having to go out and find livelihood. So on one level, yes, we have achieved a certain level of preparedness, a collective action, whole of the government action, but there's still those gaps. One is because of the global emissions. Second, at the local level, there's no coordination between different ministries. So we have a master plan for the country, for Sylhet, but that's not being implemented. We're not realizing that you can't have dams, you can't construct dams in this place because this ecological area or what is relevant for here doesn't work with dams. You need to find other measures, bridges and other infrastructure alternatives. So this is where we get, we achieve, we move 1 step forward, then we're pushed back 50 steps.
Well, thank you so much. Now, I note that we're just about at the end of the webinar, but we can certainly spare a couple more minutes. And I think maybe the best way to do that would be to ask each of you, if you'd like to make a final comment, that would be no more than a minute. And perhaps one thing to consider in that comment would be a question from me, since there haven't been a lot of questions from the audience. And perhaps, is there one thing that you found in your research that surprised you, but nevertheless turns out to be a helpful element in what you're looking to achieve? Why don't I start from the left of my screen. Cameron, anything you might want to add at the last minute?
I just think I'll say that, as I pointed out in the presentation, I think our team has identified that the lack of really specific indices targeted at specific vulnerable groups is kind of a main gap that we've noticed so far, and I think it's something that a lot of organizations or institutions would have an interest in taking up and actively engaging with in the future. And I'm not sure if Alex or Felix wants to add to that comment, but that's what I'll say for our end.
Thank you. Alex, you want to add anything?
Sorry, I was gathering some things from the chat. What was the question?
Well, it was just whether or not you want to make a final comment or share perhaps something in the research that has surprised you, but nevertheless is a meaningful contribution to what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think something that's always I guess just really like salient for me, particularly with some of the research we do over multi-level governance, is the lack of like, there's a tendency for high levels of expertise at the local and stakeholder level. And that's kind of disconnected from financing at higher levels of governance. So like a big part of it is connecting those stakeholders to the financiers or governors of almost, I mean, I feel like we've found that certainly in the United States, but in many other places as well.
Thank you, Alex. Rebecca, a comment from you.
Thanks very much. In terms of something that surprised, I think out of those 8 recommendations, none of them were particularly surprising because we work quite closely with the members and those on the ground. I think what was perhaps surprising and maybe, to be provocative, frustrating, is still having to push this need to include local voice, local knowledge, local decision making in these spaces. So the fact that there still is this need in all of these pieces of research, all of these levels of monitoring vulnerability, all of these levels of governance on vulnerability and risk, that we still need to push the importance of local voice, local expertise, and local decision making.
Thank you, Becky. Taryn?
Thank you. Yeah, I think just from my side, I think there's just 2 comments. One is there is a question in the chat about how to connect researchers and university students to on-the-ground projects in cities. So I have added my email address in the chat, but yeah, ICLEI does a lot of work with trying to connect local governments and research organizations to try and bridge that gap. So it would be good to have a look and see what the possibilities are with that, just in regard to that question. And then I think, yeah, just the one observation is the similarities between what everybody's presenting on, irrespective of what stakeholder group they're kind of fundamentally representing, and just the need to make sure that we are sharing resources and that we are using these globally kind of coordinating mechanisms, such as the UNDRR's MCR 2030 dashboard, where you can put your resources, your methodologies, your mechanisms, and actually allow a broader group to access them, so we can continue to kind of collaborate and learn from one another and not continue to reinvent the wheel. So just to be aware of those mechanisms that exist to foster improved collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Taryn. Manta, a few words from you.
Yes, in fact, from my side, I would say that the community with whom we have engaged is that they are able to do lots of measures, they are able to adopt lots of measures, except that they are not aware that they should be doing that, because it has always been a top-down approach. It's well structured. The top-down approach is very helpful because the situation is very severe. That's why it has been like that, top-down approach to help people. But people also know what to do, except that they are not confident, and sometimes they feel that it's going to take them a major financial investment to be able to do something. So I think this is where I feel that there is a lack of dialogue and a lack of opportunities for them to show what they can do, and so that they can have a voice by themselves. They can have a voice, they can contribute to the process, because at the end there is a need for a balance between the top-down approach and the bottom-up. That's my experience with the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Manta. Catalina, next, please.
Yeah, there is a great level of awareness, but low level of implementation and of processes and mechanisms which could be implemented at the local level. In terms of science, there are fragmented processes and methods there, and what we try in our project is to be aware of the existing work which has been done, but also to advance the science by mixing some of the methods which have never been really tried before, and to explore to see if there are any other meaningful insights we can take from our approach, and to integrate in a more holistic way things which have never been implemented before, to be honest.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Farah, something from you, please.
Positive surprise is how youth and women have come forward and are adapting and trying to make the changes. Negative surprise is why don't political actors and bureaucracy see what's staring in their face, and how do they bypass this reality? I mean, it never ceases to surprise me that there is still the reticence, whatever the English word is, but they're still trying to live in a balloon. And the money that needs to come for these actions is not there. They would spend 300 times more for other issues, but not to save the planet. So that's the negative surprise. But what keeps me going every morning is the women, the young people, the resilience and innovative thinking that's coming. There's never a boring day, and there's never a non-learning day. Every day I learn, so that's the best part.
Thank you. That's a fantastic way to just about wrap up. The fact that we have hope, we always have hope. Before we go, I'd just like to give Felix an opportunity to say a few words, if you'd like to, before I wrap up.
It's always dangerous, Charles. I guess, thank you all the presenters. I thought it was a very rich conversation, and I think I've learned a lot, which I think always shows a good side event where you go beyond what you know. I think from our perspective, the work we've been looking at is particularly two things that I want to underline. One is that we're approaching the COP27 presidency about the issue of trying to develop an African regional look at vulnerability. And we think that that's dealing with the vulnerability of countries. And I think that's an area that needs exploring. The SIDS have a vulnerability index, but it doesn't include resilience. So there's a whole bit of work around there. But the second thing that Cameron raised, which was that only one of the vulnerable groups, children, has a vulnerability index. And I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done for those other vulnerable groups. And then there needs to be a way by which we can bring together the vulnerability indexes for vulnerable groups and the vulnerability of countries into a more coherent process. And I would hope that if that moves forward, it will be done for 2027 when they have the next review of the SDGs beyond 2023, and also the possibility of adding indicators, new indicators that deal with vulnerability in 2027-28 when the indicators are reviewed. My final comment is the COP27 will have a resilience hub, and we're discussing with the Resilience Hub having some sessions that would be dealing with vulnerability, and anyone who's interested in that, do contact us. Thank you.
Felix, thank you very much for that final comment. So we'll wrap up now. I want to close by thanking everyone, our attendees, but especially our panelists for joining us today. We look forward to this discussion being continued during the HLPF meeting this week and for events beyond that. Thank you all. Goodbye, and have a very good day, evening, and such. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Thank you, and bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.